Hello Foundation fans, fellow Mudbeards, and anyone who's curious and wants to know a little bit more about what's going on with Kalle and Demerzel from the Foundation series. So again, there's timestamps in the video. This first section will just be theorizing about what we've seen so far. But I feel to really get into my point that I'm going to be trying to make by the end of this video, I have to start with a very broad umbrella concept, and that is about robots and their involvement in entertainment media. In our time, we've had many great phenomenal stories that center completely around the concept of one specific robot, or type of robot. An example of this could be something along the lines of the Terminator franchise, where the initial problem and threat is one particular robot, and the series slowly alludes to how big that threat will become, mostly due to corporation growth. This was an interesting way to show a story because it introduced us to the threat of robotics right away, and the pipeline humanity would follow to get ourselves to the point where we created our own problem like this. There's other stories as well that rely very much on a digital or robotic type of world or setting, but when you really break it down to brass tacks, robots aren't the biggest problem, that being the Matrix series. For anyone who hasn't watched the series, when you start getting into the story, it's very easy to convince yourself that something's going on regarding robots with everything happening. And as the story progresses, you find out that's not exactly the case, but again, I think the Matrix specifically falls in line with the theme I'm trying to point out, which is humanity's ignorance and acceptance for technology's influence in their world. So, while the Terminator series shows a more immediate physical threat of robotics or androids, the Matrix more holds up a mirror to humanity and shows that if whatever these robots or androids are doing help us feel more complacent in our lives and a little more happy, then who cares what their grand goals are as a whole, or how it will affect humanity in the long term. To really hammer in my point about the Matrix, I'm primarily alluding to the fact that humanity as a whole will definitely be complacent and even set ourselves up for failure in regards to creating a technology that gets a job done easier and more efficiently. Humanity has a consistent problem with not fully thinking ahead, and with the development of these type of technologies and the ripping away of our agency to accomplish things ourselves, we're not too far from being some soulless meat husks inside of a pod that some aliens are controlling like the Matrix, or the last of humanity floating in a spaceship above a destroyed world like WALL-E. And sure, WALL-E could seem like a very random IP to throw in here out of nowhere, but the main reason I even wanted to bring up WALL-E was to segue to my next point. See, in WALL-E, we find that humanity is floating up, totally comfortable, fat in their chairs and getting whatever they want, completely complacent but quickly dying out, all because they've devoted their full selves into technology and how it can take care of them. And while this was a little bit more gimmicky and a little bit more cartoony for where humanity could potentially go, I do find it to be a more kid-friendly example that helps segue into my next point, and that is to touch on another series known as Raised by Wolves. Now, for anyone who hasn't seen Raised by Wolves, it's a very interesting story that had a full narrative arc planned out for 5 seasons. It was released on HBO Max, and while the narrative itself can be a little bit hard to get into in understanding some of the characters and their dynamics, what really hooks you is all of these questions and concepts that they're actually presenting to you on screen. I won't go too much into Raised by Wolves and explaining the story here in this video, but if you are interested in a Raised by Wolves video, let me know, because I was a big fan of the show. But to put it bluntly, essentially 2 androids are sent off to a new planet to basically help restart humanity. They're sent with several embryos and slowly try to raise these humans on their new world. Throughout the story, you learn that what happened back on Earth, resulting in them needing to leave to this new planet, was a religious holy war. Essentially, in this sci-fi story, Earth fell due to a huge war between the Mithraic, a religious holy faction following an old deity, and partially based on the real-life faction of Mithricism, but most likely just in name, and their war with the atheists. See, the Mithraic believed in this deity named Sol, this guiding light that would help keep humanity safe. And the atheists, well, on paper you could think, we don't believe in whatever god these people are worshipping, so we're gonna fight against them. But again, you realize that the atheists and the reason they're willing to sacrifice so much of themselves for a war in this series isn't just because this giant group that controls most of the planet believes in this god they don't believe in, but can primarily be attributed to the fact that it's later revealed the atheists follow their own form of deity. This deity being a type of advanced AI. See, this AI entity helps guide the atheists and essentially put them up to the war against the Mithraic in the first place. And through all their trials and tribulations, eventually most atheists rely full-heartedly on this machine. To the point where if this machine is no longer able to give instructions, these atheists are left completely floundering. Specifically, the Raised by Wolves comparison is noticing how an AI could be seen as a deity. Again, these atheists were essentially worshipping this AI entity, and had this AI entity physically removed itself and become an unembodied voice, there'd be no real difference between worship of some sort of godly figure and what the atheists are worshipping. But that will go ahead and end our current Raised by Wolves section of the video. So what does all this actually have to do with humanity's reliance on technology, or the point I'm trying to make? Essentially, whether it's a physical threat being shown as a mirror straight to our face, or a corporation's potential in expanding to the point where they could take over, or how humanity's complacency and dependency on these machines can render us genuinely extinct. But there's another story out there that I believe perfectly represents these themes in a more specific way, and that would be, of course, Isaac Asimov's The Last Question. Now, to give a very brief summary of what The Last Question is essentially about, it follows different ages of humanity and their reliance on this machine. This machine is evolving through time throughout the story, as well as the concepts of sci-fi that humanity relies upon. What starts out in a semi-sci-fi future quickly evolves into humans being able to connect their minds through a form of neural link, to essentially human beings reaching the point where they keep their physical bodies in pods on planets, but their consciousness, due to the crazy evolving of sci-fi technology, that is allowed to roam freely across the galaxy. And throughout this story, in different eras of time that we see humanity, they approach this AI entity with one specific question: how do we reverse human entropy? See, human beings, we're evolving, we're expanding, but eventually, what's left? What is the point? Once we discover literally everything and have control over literally everything, if there is a limit, where do we find our actual purpose or direction in this grand universe? And every time these humans ask this AI entity this question, it's unable to come up with a response. But again, throughout this story, this AI box/figure is also evolving, so it slowly starts to consume different organic materials from different star systems to keep itself running. And while still never being able to answer the question, it eventually reaches a point in the story where it's no longer just absorbing organic material, but also absorbing human consciousnesses into one specific grand consciousness, losing their individuality and becoming one. As the universe slowly shrinks around them and darkness takes hold, eventually we reach the point where there's one last individual piece of consciousness who's representing the last form of life in what was once a grand display of a universe and is now an endless dark void. With no other real questions to ask except for one, they yet again try to get this box who's capable of answering literally any question to answer this: how do we reverse human entropy? And once again, the box is unable to answer, leaving this human left to give up their individuality and absorb themselves within this machine, leaving nothing left but the collective consciousness of humanity into one single entity, and this machine that's borderline magical at this point, basically harboring it. And once this machine is left alone in complete and utter darkness, it is finally able to come to the conclusion and answer for the last question, leading to arguably the best part in the entire story, the Big Bang, and the creation of life as we know it. So that story, genuinely pretty interesting. Is humanity caught in a loop? Are we in a next phase of existence after that point? Who knows? The primary reason I even bring it up is just to emphasize how much humanity can depend on technology, even if we weren't the ones to necessarily develop it. I think with the real world examples and the many stories we've come up with before we even had the evidence to believe as such, humanity, I just have to say, is destined to create this machine problem that will eventually hold a lot of agency over our lives. The outcome of this circumstance, who knows? But it makes for some great storytelling, and me and you will likely be dead before the robot wars even happen, so. But let's talk a little bit more about Asimov and his understanding of robots. See, while robots and humanity's involvement with them has had some pretty interesting takes throughout the years, Asimov seemed to have a distinct comprehension of robots that wasn't as reliant on humanity's downfall or robots' attempt at destroying humanity altogether. Essentially, the biggest conflict were how do these robots follow the rules that humans placed upon them. Foundation fans probably know of YouTuber Pete Peppers, who recently dropped a Demerzel video, and he kind of goes into Asimov's relationship with robots as a whole. And a conclusion I came to while watching this video was that Asimov was way better at creating these sci-fi concepts that were very thought-provoking than developing characters with full narrative arcs that would be satisfying. And while eventually in the Foundation series we did get some very enjoyable characters, it's obvious that Foundation was never intended to be a character-driven story. But what kind of story is Foundation? Well, essentially, Foundation follows the story of psychohistory. See, psychohistory is the study of large groups of humanity's actions to predict the potential future for where humanity could go. And with the advancement in mathematics and technologies in this universe, to the point where a lot of these things come off as almost magical, it's easy to rely on the consistency of the math that psychohistory presents. But there's a key word I use there, and that's math. See, Foundation, as a narrative, relies heavily on psychohistory, which is a very mechanical and abstract concept that human beings, or at least the individual human being, would find a hard time having faith in. As again, human beings have a hard time looking at the larger picture, rather than the circumstances and events they face in their present day. It takes a special kind of mind and a special kind of dedication to sacrifice everything of yourself in the hopes of following this formula to keep humanity where it needs to go. But again, this formula doesn't follow the individual. You're not going to see in these predictions that being nice to someone who could potentially be a tyrant in the future will actually make them a good person and help humanity in the long run. Again, it's gauging statistically how decisions are made by large portions of humanity, and where these decisions could eventually lead us. This is a very mechanical outlook on things, and no human being, even given the gift of eternal life, would be able to fully consistently stick through on this plan. No, a mechanical plan needs a being of a mechanical nature. Which leads me to my next point, and potential minor spoilers if you haven't actually watched the Foundation series yet, but throughout the Foundation series, we have two presumed robots that have been lurking in the background and helping make these decisions or guide humanity decisions in general. These two robots confirmed to be Demerzel in ruling the Empire, and presumably Kalle, who's been this more mysterious lurking figure in the background. But if you want to know more about Kalle and my thoughts and theories about her specifically, feel free to check out this video here. I also break down all of her story impacts within the series that we've gotten so far. But let's take these two robots. See, you have Demerzel, who is known to be guiding humanity as the Forever Empress in Cleon the First's design, someone who has her own history in the robot wars, but essentially had all of her agency erased, and with her servitude to humanity being replaced with her servitude to the Cleonic Age. That's one robot that's almost a prisoner, ruling by obligation, duty, and by no other choice. Then you have Kalle. Her interest in humanity is an intriguing one, and Harry's questioning of her actual interest here, I believe, is very eluding. Where this could go with her character, who knows, but essentially all of humanity you see right now, Torin, Beta, Gale, and even the Mule, are all direct results of the actions taken by both Kalle and Demerzel. Now, with the way I'm kind of portraying it in this video, it'd be easy to think that maybe these two robots were actually working together and secretly communicating in the background. But I'm gonna go ahead and tell you right now, I do not think that's the case. For anyone who watched the show, you should be able to piece together why, but for the most part, I think that Demerzel isn't doing a lot of this by choice. From the context we've been given, she lost the robot wars and was imprisoned for thousands of years. And sure, those could have been necessary steps in order to eventually succeed in her plans. But if that was the case, all of her plans would rely on her meeting a particular human being with a very particular temperament. That ended up being Cleon. No, like psychohistory as a whole, no one would be able to predict one individual's actions come the future, without some form of hallucinatory vision like Gale got of the Mule. No, I believe in actuality, we've seen and gotten most of Demerzel's story told directly to us. And like most of the other characters, if not more so, we are following her story throughout this narrative, and how she responds and interacts with psychohistory and humanity's long-term journey. And while there are obviously some personality differences between both Demerzel and Kalle, as Demerzel doesn't have a lot of passion or love for humanity, she still presents herself as a very empathetic person, but not a robotic being capable of the same things that Kalle is capable of. See, while Demerzel shows some empathy for humanity from time to time, there is no saying where she would want humanity to end up in the long run, as she'd honestly have every reason to work against humanity should she ever gain her freedom, with the only potential threat in really stopping her not being Mentalics, as she's an android and can't be mentally manipulated, but being Kalle. See, Demerzel wouldn't be physically impossible to stop, but she would be tough considering how smart and prepared she probably would be. Kalle, on the other hand, does seem like someone who's even a few steps ahead of Demerzel. Kalle is also someone who is capable of presenting herself as a deity in different forms within the Prime Radiant, capable of utilizing technology or creating herself an actual body for a human consciousness, or even folding space through a doorway in someone's room. It's obvious that if Demerzel had Kalle's abilities, they would be presented to the table now. That, or she just hasn't learned what she's fully capable of yet. You could also argue that Kalle has a little more control over her interactions with humanity. See, Demerzel and her actions do decide the outcome of the Empire, and in tandem, the fate of the galactic people, but as we've seen with Season 2, even with her best efforts being put forward from childhood for a Cleon, with simultaneously managing an Empire and trying to guide a Cleon in the right direction, she's proven that she's incapable of doing both, reiterating the same exact point to Cleon the 17th in regards to his pride, right before he enacted the first entire enclosure around a planet. And while there may come a moment where Kalle needs a human to do something specifically, and this would show how much agency she actually has over them, I think for now it's fair to say she's just a few steps ahead of Demerzel. Then there can't be more proof of that than in the fact that from what we've seen so far, Kalle has had more involvement in the creation of the Prime Radiant and Psycho history than Demerzel has. See, Kalle, or at least the human entity Kalle bases herself off of, had their work as well as Yana and Harry Seldon's, and potentially influences from many other places, put into the Prime Radiant that supposedly resulted in the creation of this deity known as Kalle. But it could also be possible that this deity of Kalle, or the robot that Kalle is presenting herself as, was even making moves before the Prime Radiant was invented. But where does that leave Kalle and Demerzel and their potential plans for the rest of the story? Well, I'm going to throw out some most likely theories that I've seen out there for Kalle, and then where I think Demerzel could be going. In regards to Kalle, I think there's 3 potential options for who she could be. 2 of these options have to do with time travel, so they're less likely. That being that Kalle could be Demerzel from the future, sort of helping orchestrate things and seeing that they're both robots, or that Kalle could even potentially be Gale from the future. But there's also a 3rd theory, and that could be that Kalle is actually Gaian. And it's potentially very possible that she could become the face for Gaia. Potential book spoilers, but she could also represent humanity's optional choice in Galaxia. Essentially, it's revealed that humanity has a couple of choices for where they want the species to go. One of those options would be the Second Foundation. I think most people would agree choosing Second Foundation is probably least on the priority list for where humanity could go, as Mentalics, though very useful, are also very dangerous. As we've seen with the character of Gale, who is genuinely an empathetic and very kind person, whose mentalic abilities has left her to do some really shady things, whether it be to unknowingly persuade or mentally manipulate people, or letting an entire planet of people potentially die in a gambit because of a vision she saw due to her powers. Again, in any of these scenarios, I don't think anybody will really be choosing the Second Foundation or Mentalics to guide humanity in the long run. And another option that I'm primarily trying to reference here is Galaxia. Galaxia being Gaia's ultimate plan and having humanity and everything in the universe become one super organism. This would definitely play into Kalle's line about being vested in humanity's destiny rather than humanity's survival. The only other likely theory I have for Kalle, if she isn't a representative for Gaia, is that she's a representative for eternity. Someone who is capable of traveling across reality and time at a moment's notice. Eternity, for people who don't know, was another book by Isaac Asimov that primarily centered around the idea of controlling reality or the timeline. For Marvel fans, this is sort of like a more sophisticated version of the TVA, though considering the character we follow in that novel, I don't really know if sophisticated is the word I'd use, as anyone with the power to travel across time like that probably will become disillusioned with reality. But where does that leave Demerzel? Well, she's already revealed herself to be Daneel, and in the books, Daneel plays one of the key aspects in kind of orchestrating events so that humanity would be presented this choice in the very end anyways. But the series seems to be taking a lot of variations and twists with the Daneel character, including how Demerzel is presented to us on screen. We already know that Demerzel, or Daneel, is being prophesized by the Inheritance to return and basically help everybody out. Also, a quick side note that I'll probably reference in my episode breakdown, but if that song that Demerzel sang was actually an indicator for how robots clasp or come together to share memories, then that essentially means Demerzel was singing the song of ultimate empathy with her people to the Cleons while they were in the decampment chamber, truly symbolizing how alone she is in this imprisonment, reaching out for any form of connection and never really finding one that's real. There's only 2 culprits for who could have spawned this entire religion in the first place, and that would be the same person I believe spawned the Church of Luminism, which you can check out in my Foundation's religion video. But essentially, I believe this prophecy was actually started by Demerzel herself. For Dune fans, not only playing the role of the Bene Gesserit, but also of the Kwisatz Haderach. or as my friends like to refer to it as, the Quiznos Tesseract. But to touch back on the recent prophecy we heard about with the inheritance, is it possible if it wasn't for Demerzel, it's actually Kalle who started the prophecy, helping place Demerzel or Daneel into the position they need to be at? Either way, with the confirmation that Demerzel did have a hand to play in the bombing of the Star Bridge, I think it's safe to say that she also could be manipulating much more than that. Like, for instance, maybe the start of the genetic decline in the first place. See, it's become a very pivotal plot point that there's been a genetic drift in the Cleonic dynasty. Part of me wonders, it seems 2 of the 3 new Cleons we have a much better temperament than any of the previous Cleons before them. Which begs the next question, could the genetic drift or the tampering of Cleon I's DNA sample have been started by Demerzel in the first place? And if so, why would she do this? Well, maybe Cleon, while being a master of some horrific actions, is still a very capable individual and a very powerful human being at that. And potentially, seeing that she was trapped in her current situation, she figured a way to help preserve Empire was for Empire to eventually change their temperament with the times, so that one day the Empire could be led by a Cleon who was truly magnificent or worthy. That could even be Cleon 25, and this would still keep with her programming to serve Empire. It's been strongly hinted at that if she's free, she'll kill whoever's in her way, or maybe even whoever's directly in front of her. Which, considering the thousands of years she's ever had freedom, I kinda don't blame her. But I guess that does leave the question up in the air, where do you guys think the story could go for both Kalle and Demerzel? Are they working together to guide humanity as partners at the end of time? Or are they doomed to face off to really determine the outcome of humanity's fate when the final decision needs to be made? Do you prefer one character's illustration over the other? Do you believe one character is a better choice to rule or guide over the other? Either way, let me know what you think down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. And remember to let me know who you're voting for in Robot Wars 2 Electric Boogaloo.